If you'll please join me and take out your Bibles and turn to the book of 2 Samuel, please. We'll be in 2 Samuel chapter 13 this morning. Second Samuel chapter 13. This will be the text for our sermon this morning, and we'll read it ahead of time. 2 Samuel chapter 13. Now it was after this that Absalom, the son of David, had a beautiful sister whose name was Tamar, and Amnon, the son of David, loved her. Amnon was so frustrated because of his sister Tamar that he made himself ill, for she was a virgin, and it seemed hard for Amnon to do anything to her. But Amnon had a friend whose name was Jonadab, the son of Shimeah, David's brother. And Jonadab was a very shrewd man. He said to him, "O son of the king, why are you so depressed morning after morning? Will you not tell me?" And Amnon said to him, "I am in love with Tamar, the sister of my brother Absalom." Jonadab then said to him, "Lie down on your bed and pretend to be ill. When your father comes to see you, say to him, 'Please, let my sister Tamar come and give me some food to eat, and let her prepare the food in my sight, that I may see it and eat it from her hand.'" So Amnon lay down and pretended to be ill. When the king came to see him, Amnon said to the king, "Please, let my sister Tamar come and make me a couple of cakes in my sight, that I may eat from her hand." David sent to the house of Tamar, saying, "Go now to your brother Amnon's house and prepare food for him." So Tamar went to her brother Amnon's house, and he was laying down. She took dough, kneaded it, made cakes in his sight, and baked the cakes. She took the pan and dished them out before him, but he refused to eat. And Amnon said to her, "Have everyone go out from me." So everyone went out from him. Then Amnon said to Tamar, "Bring the food into the bedroom, that I may eat from your hand." So Tamar took the cakes when she had made and brought them into his bedroom to her brother Amnon. When she brought them to him to eat, he took hold of her and said to her, "Come, lie with me, my sister." But she answered him, "No, my brother, do not violate me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do this disgraceful thing. As for me, where could I get rid of my reproach? And as for you, you will be like one of the fools of Israel. Now therefore, please speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you." However, he would not listen to her. Since he was stronger than her, he violated her and lay with her. Then Amnon hated her with a very great hatred, for the hatred with which he had hated her was greater than the love which he had loved her. And Amnon said to her, "Get up, go away." But she said to him, "No, because this wrong in setting me away is greater than the other that you have done to me." Yet he would not listen to her. Then he called his young men who attended him and said, "Now throw this woman out of my presence and lock the door behind her." But she had on a long-sleeved garment, for in this manner the virgin daughters of the king dressed themselves in robes. Then his attendant took her out and locked the door behind her. Tamar put ashes on her head and tore her long-sleeved garment which was on her, and she put a hand on her head and went about crying aloud as she went. Then Absalom, her brother, said to her, "Has Amnon your brother been with you? But now keep silent, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this matter to heart." So Tamar remained and was desolate in her brother Absalom's house. Now when King David heard of all these things, he was very angry. But Absalom did not speak to Amnon, either good or bad, for Absalom hated Amnon because he had violated his sister Tamar. Now it came about, after 2 full years, that Absalom had sheep shearers in Baal-hazor, which is near Ephraim, and Absalom invited all the king's sons. Absalom came to the king and said, "Behold, now your servant has sheep shearers. Please let the king and his servants go with your servant." But the king said to Absalom, "No, my son, we should not all go, for we will be burdensome to you." Although he urged him, he would not go, but blessed him. Then Absalom said, "If not, please let my brother Amnon go with us." The king said to him, "Why should he go with you?" But when Absalom urged him, he let Amnon and all the king's sons go with him. Absalom commanded his servants, saying, "See now, when Amnon's heart is merry with wine, and when I say to you, 'Strike Amnon,' then put him to death. Do not fear. Have I not myself commanded you, be strong, be courageous, and valiant?" The servants of Absalom did to Amnon just as Absalom had commanded. Then all the king's sons arose, and each mounted his mule and fled. Now it was while they were on the way that the report came to David, saying, "Absalom has struck down all the king's sons, and not one of them is left." Then the king arose, tore his clothes, and lay on the ground, and all his servants were standing by with clothes torn. Jonadab, the son of Shemiah, David's brother, responded, "Do not let my lord suppose that they have put to death all the young men, the king's sons, for Amnon alone is dead, because by the intent of Absalom this has been determined since the day that he violated his sister Tamar. Now, therefore, do not let the Lord my king take this report to heart, namely all the king's sons are dead, for only Amnon is dead." But Absalom had fled, and the young man who was the watchman raised his eyes and looked, and behold, many people were coming from the road behind him by the side of the mountain. Jonadab said to the king, "Behold, the king's sons have come according to your servant's word." So it happened. As soon as he had finished speaking, behold, the king's sons came and lifted their voices and wept. And also the king and all his servants wept very bitterly. Now Absalom fled and went to Talmai, the son of Ahimaud, the king of Geshur. And David mourned for his son every day. But Absalom had fled and gone to Geshur and was there 3 years. The heart of King David longed to go out to Absalom, for he was comforted concerning Amnon, since he was dead.
Thank you, Tim. In 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul wrote a local church. And in chapter 5, verse 1, it reads, "It is actually reported that there is immorality among you, and immorality of such a kind that it does not even exist among the Gentiles." Now stop and think about that for a moment. The apostle says that there are some sins which are so wicked that even the world is disgusted by it. Now, what sins do you think are on that list? Well, I think we find at least 3 of them in our passage this morning. In 2 Samuel chapter 13, we are going to look at the sins of Amnon, David, and Absalom. And if you notice during the reading, this is a very ugly, painful chapter. One of the reasons this chapter is so sinful is because it is also so godless. Did you notice that the Lord is not mentioned one time in these 39 verses? And you don't have to be a Christian to read this chapter and to feel certain things. In fact, I think Christians and non-Christians can read this chapter and to feel angry, to feel sad, to cringe at what's here. But there's one difference, I think, in how, as Christians, we read this versus how unbelievers might read this, is that while we read this and cringe, and we also weep, and we also grow angry, we can also read this chapter and we can hope. You say hope. You see, the sins that this chapter describes are so ugly and so evil, we know that even in our world, sometimes murderers get away with it. And sometimes sex offenders get away with it. And sometimes crooked politicians get away with it. But Romans chapter 2, verse 16 tells us quite clearly that there is coming a day when, quote, God will judge the secrets of men through Jesus Christ. And the hope that we have in reading this text is that God will do what the courts and the prisons can't do. God will see to it that justice is served and righteousness is upheld. And so, yes, we weep and cringe and even grow angry at this text, but we also read it with great hope. And if you're here this morning and you're not a Christian, my friend, the gospel not only offers to you your own salvation, but a reminder that God will come and save all things. And He will set the record straight. And He will bring true justice to our world. This chapter 13, of course, flows out of what we just read last 2 Sundays. Chapter 11, David commits sin. He commits adultery with Bathsheba and murders Uriah. Then in chapter 12, Nathan comes to him. The prophet exposes his sin. David confesses his sin. And then the Lord forgave his sin. Now, it could be easy to say, okay, we're done. But not so fast. Because David is going to learn the very hard lesson that even forgiven sins can have serious consequences. You can throw a pebble in a pond and you can go get that rock back, but you can't undo the splash or stop the ripples. And David's choices are going to make a splash in his family and ripple out through the entire kingdom. And here we see that his sins that are planted in his own family will bloom in the lives of his children. If you're a note taker this morning, we're going to look at this chapter under 3 sins: Ammon's assault, David's inaction, and Absalom's revenge. We begin with Amnon's assault. Notice verse 1. Now it was after this that Absalom, the son of David, had a beautiful sister whose name was Tamar, and Amnon, the son of David, loved her. In that one verse, we are introduced to all of our key characters: Absalom, David, Tamar, Amnon. The first name there is Absalom, and it's because the author is setting us up for what's coming in the next few weeks. Chapter 13 and following is the beginning of the Absalom versus David saga. There's going to be a power struggle, a tug of war for the throne. And the author is giving us the backstory to what prompts this struggle. And this struggle began by 2 of David's other children, and that is Amnon and Tamar. Verse 1 tells us that Tamar was beautiful and that Amnon knew she was beautiful. In fact, it says he loved her. There is no doubt that the author is using the word love here ironically. He's saying Amnon's hormones were shooting off like fireworks, and so he assumed this must be love. If I have such a strong sexual desire, this has to be what love is. And so Amnon found himself with these feelings that he had, but it's quite clear this is not love. This is nothing more than self-centered lust. Love is not always what anybody thinks it is. In fact, as we read this passage as a family, I told my kids, and particularly my 12-year-old daughter, I said, there are some boys who will say, I love you, but what they mean is, I love me. Amnon only loves himself. In fact, verse 2 says he had such strong desires, he was frustrated. It was an obsession for him. And he wants to act on it, but he knows that he shouldn't do this. He knows that he can't do this. She is protected as the princess. It is illegal, and so he doesn't know how to do it. But then verse 3 says, but Amnon had a friend. Now just think about that phrase. Amnon had a friend. You know the old quote, show me your friends and I'll show you your future? Amnon is a crafty, wicked, shrewd man. And he slithers into the garden, if you will, and lays down a temptation. He doesn't tell him what to do. He just gives him a plan of how he could possibly do this. I think it's using the word friend there again, ironically. A person who tempts you to sin is not your friend. He can see that Amnon is lovesick, so he asks him what's going on. Verse 4, he confides in him, tells him he's infatuated with Tamar, his sister, so he gives them this idea. He says, go and lay down on your bed. The last time we saw the word bed was back in chapter 11. David got up from his bed and went out on the roof. The bed is a signal word that sin is coming. And so he hears the plan that Jonadab gives him, and so he goes and he lays down on the bed. He pretends to be sick, and the king comes to check on him. And so he makes his request, send my sister Tamar to make me some food. In verse 7, David sent to the house of Tamar, saying, go now to your brother Amnon's house and prepare food for him. What an innocent and harmless moment. Who hasn't done something like this, that your sibling is sick and your parents say, take him some Sprite and crackers? You know, just go check and see if he needs anything. Every sibling would do that, knowing that, you know, you've been there before. You'd want somebody to care for you. And Tamar very eagerly, very innocently, very lovingly makes her way to Amnon's house. When I prepare sermons, I write the text out by hand. And as I was writing this week, I got to verse 8, and I realized it was a strange verse. Look at verse 8. So Tamar went to her brother Amnon's house as he was lying down, and she took dough and kneaded it, and made cakes in his sight, and baked the cakes, and she took the pan and dished them out before him. Isn't that a lot of unnecessary details? I was thinking about it, and it dawned on me. This is one of the creepiest verses in the Bible because the author is making us watch the story through Amnon's eyes. He puts us on the bed, seeing his sister with the purest of motives, looking to care for her brother, and yet he with the most impure motives. As the bread rises, so does his desire to do evil. And so he refuses to eat and says, send everyone out, and they send everyone out of the room. And in verse 10, he says, bring me the food. She does the same, and it says that in verse 11, he took hold of her and said to her, come lie with me, my sister. How on earth can those two phrases come out of your mouth at the same time? Come lie with me, my sister. The perversion of this text shows that human depravity knows no end. In fact, the term sister could be a term of endearment. If you know Song of Solomon, that is used between a husband and wife in their sort of bedroom language. He calls her his sister. So it's very possible that Amnon thinks he's being romantic and yet is betraying his own perversion. And so he grabs hold of her and says this to her in verse 12, but she answered him, notice, no, my brother, do not violate me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do this disgraceful thing. As for me, where could I get rid of my reproach? And as for you, you will be like one of the fools in Israel. Now, therefore, please speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you. She begins by saying, do not violate me. Everything is a gross violation. In fact, another pastor, I thought he did such a great job. I'm borrowing from him at this point. He notes all of the violations that we see captured in her words. It says he took hold of her, meaning he violated her body. He physically overpowered her. Men should use their God-given strength to protect women, never to traumatize them. She calls him my brother, meaning he violates her trust. Sexual assault is evil enough, but when it's done by a family member, such a thing is not done in Israel. He violates the law. This is not just a little sin, this is criminal what he does. She says, do not do this, meaning he violates her will, as if she doesn't have a choice in the matter. She doesn't want to do this, but he takes that away from her. She calls it a disgraceful thing, meaning he violates the dignity of marriage. Marital sex between a husband and wife, that is a graceful thing. It is a good gift of God meant to strengthen the marriage and be open to children, right? It is the beauty of what God has given to us in marriage, and that which goes outside of it brings disgrace. And she says, it is a disgraceful thing. By attacking her, he is attacking God's design. Verse 13, as for me, where could I get rid of my reproach? He violates her future. This will impact her for the rest of her life. Between anxiety and nightmares and shame and disgrace. And then he violates his own conscience. He said, and you will be like one of the fools in Israel. He knows right and wrong, but he doesn't care. In the end, she says, speak to the king. He will not withhold me from you. I don't think she genuinely is proposing that they get married. You say, then what is she doing? I think she's trying to buy time. I think she's doing what any person would do in this situation, is throwing the kitchen sink of objections at him, trying to make him stop. And she throws everything at him that she possibly can. I told my children this week, if a person ever tries to take sexual advantage of you, you do what Tamar did. You do everything you can to make them stop. Because nobody should be violated like this. And yet, despite her protest, verse 14, however, he would not listen to her. And since he was stronger than she, he violated her and lay with her. In that moment, she was not a sister. She was not a woman. She was not even a human being. To him, she was just an object. My friends, this is why it is so important that we guard our hearts. We live in a world that so objectifies humans, particularly women. And we may not be guilty of assault, but are we guilty of objectifying? Of seeing skin and curves for what it is and thinking it is ours for the taking? That's where it started. And his reaction proves that's all he thinks. In verse 15 it says, then Amnon hated her with a very great hatred, for the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love which he had loved her. And Amnon said to her, get up and go away. Like a piece of gum, he chewed her up and spit her out. Just garbage tossed aside. And that's even more clear in verse 17. Then he called the young man who attended him and said, now throw this woman out of my presence and lock the door behind her. The word woman is actually only implied in the Hebrew. It says something like, now throw this thing out. He's gotten what he wants. He has used her and abused her for all it's worth. You see, Amnon's hormones had convinced him that this would make him happy. This is what he wanted. But notice, it left him miserable on the other side. Brothers and sisters, let's remember, sin always overpromises and underdelivers. It always does. Temptation will project a mirage of pleasure, but on the other side, it's just a desert of pain. And he gets to the other side of this and is more miserable than before. Amnon violated her privately, but Tamar grieves publicly. Notice in a the passage mentions her long sleeve garment in a deeply symbolic way. She puts ashes on her head and her hands over her head, and she takes this very ornate princess gown that she had, which showed her status, and she ripped the sleeves. It was her way of showing what had happened to her. Her innocence and virginity and future and status had all been ripped from her, and she feels as if she is no longer beautiful. And so she covers her head in ashes, and she goes out crying. What an awful story. What a horrifying story. And yet the sad reality is this is not an isolated story. If statistics hold true, and I did my math right, there are as many as 70 people in this room who've had an experience like this. And my friends, if you're among those 70 people, I am so sorry. Words cannot express. And if nobody has ever said it to you, let me be the first. You did not deserve this. It does not matter the circumstances. It was not your fault. You are not to blame, and you are not responsible. And though you feel the pain and loss and all of that, my friend, you are precious in the sight of God. And you are made in His image, and He loves you. The courage of Tamar in this text is unimaginable. That this thing happened privately, but she immediately goes out publicly in this gesture to show her shame and to show what she went through. And there may be someone here today, you've never had the courage, the faith of Tamar to tell somebody what happened. And I would just want you to know, I would encourage you, when you feel ready to do it, somebody will be here to listen. Find a person you trust. Our elders, others, our wives. It's the way that Tamar began to grieve through this. If you're in that group, I wish I had a silver bullet for you or a simple fix. I don't have that to offer you this morning. But I do have something to offer you. And what I do have to offer you is Jesus. You say, what does Jesus know about this? Matthew 27:35 says, and when they crucified him, they divided his garments. We read that on Good Friday and move past it and not think about the fact of what that means. They uncovered his nakedness. His clothing was forcibly ripped from him. And he was hung on the cross, experiencing the shame and the embarrassment and the humiliation of having his dignity taken from him. And my friends, if you feel that, listen, we have a great high priest who can sympathize. And he is ready to hear you, to receive you, and to climb down into the ditch with you. Tamar is the victim, but Amnon is the perpetrator. And his sin is sickening. But it's not the only sin in this passage. We must move on. We'll move it from Amnon's assault to David's inaction. David's inaction. The news of what happened gets to David. And notice real quickly, verse 21. Now when King David heard of all these matters, he was very angry. What's striking about verse 21 is not what it says, it's what it doesn't say. It should say, and he was very angry, and then called his soldiers to go arrest Amnon. The Old Testament law was crystal clear that a rapist, it was capital punishment. There was no denying that. He knew what should have been done. But David doesn't do this. And we know he doesn't do this because verse 23 says, and now it came about after 2 full years. Time passed. Why doesn't David do anything? Well, the text doesn't say directly. Amnon was his firstborn son. Maybe he was playing favorites. Maybe he felt guilty because he sent Tamar to him. Maybe he thought he had lost the moral high ground. Who am I? I've already committed adultery, and so, I'm not really in a position to do anything. So he becomes angry. My friends, listen, when innocent people are victimized, anger is good, but it's not enough. Crimes demand more than outrage. It demands justice. You've heard the old quote, the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. And David did nothing. And it was a sickening sin of unjust authority on 2 levels. First of all, he's their father. David ignores the sin in his own family, which should sound familiar in 2 Samuel because Eli had wicked sons and he didn't correct them. Samuel had wicked sons. He didn't correct them. Now David has wicked sons, and he doesn't correct them. And if you think I'm just imposing this on the text, in 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 6, David has another son named Adonijah who goes off and does some wicked things. And it says in the text that David, his father, never rebuked him, saying, "Why did you do this thing?" David was the poster child of a passive dad. And even though his sons were adults, this is a reminder to every mom and dad in the room that, as I like to say, parent is a verb. It starts when they're young. Proverbs says, "He who withholds the rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him diligently." David refused to discipline his sons diligently. Parents, don't set your kids up for failure. Don't say, "Well, boys will be boys. Well, I want to be their friend." My friends, there's a time and a place to provide discipline. And David didn't do it. But not just as their father, also as the king. The streets of Israel were less safe because Amnon's walking around. It's not hard to find this kind of injustice and inaction in our world today. The modern day David is the manager who hears about sexual harassment but doesn't report it to HR. The modern day David is the denominational leader who has a list of hundreds of names of abusers but pretends like he doesn't have it. The modern day David is the family member who knows an assault has happened but doesn't involve any authorities because we don't want more family drama. He has told you, "Oh man, what is good? And what does the Lord require of you? To do justice." Not just to know justice or to love justice, but to do justice. And David did not do justice. Do you struggle with moral cowardice? Do you think, "Well, I've messed up. I don't think I should hold anybody else accountable"? In some ways, I think that maybe David's sin here, it could be described as a worse sin than what he did before. You say, how is that possible? Well, he committed adultery and murder, which of course is terrible. But this sin is what's going to lead to a civil war. The whole nation is going to rip apart because of David's inaction. Because God had put him in the place to do the job. To whom much is given, much is required, and he refused to do it. And so since David won't do it, Absalom decides he will. Which leads us to the third sin. Amnon's assault, David's inaction, and number 3, Absalom's revenge. Absalom's revenge. The story now comes full circle back to where it's really intending to take us, which is to Absalom. He takes his sister in for a while, I think cares for her, and I think he's waiting for David to do something. But verse 23, now it came about after 2 full years. Right? Nothing has taken place, nothing has happened, and so Absalom decides he's going to do it. He's been seething. Verse 22 tells us that he is holding a grudge against Amnon. There is hatred and bitterness inside of him for what he did. And so he decides to do something about it. It's harvest time with sheep shearers. He invites a party. He says, "David, why don't you come bring all the sons?" And David says, "No, I don't want to put you out. Don't worry about it." And he says, "Well, how about all my brothers come?" And so he finally does, and make sure at least Amnon comes. Right? He could be a stand-in for David as the oldest. Maybe it would seem that way, somewhat symbolic. And so he insists, let Amnon come. And so David says, "Sure, I'll let him go." Some would say, why isn't David suspicious? It's been 2 years. It's been a long time. And so verse 28, Absalom commanded his servants, saying, "See now, when Amnon's heart is merry with wine, and when I say to you, strike Amnon, then put him to death." By the way, these two sins, the sexual sin and now the murder, this is David's sin on steroids. Right? David was adultery. This was incestuous rape. David's murder was like a private secret letter, right? A little this is like an open This is like an open plan. He has a staff meeting. This is what we're all going to do. And then to make it worse, look at the end of verse 28. He says to his men, when they plot this murder, "Do not fear. Have I myself not commanded you? Be courageous and valiant." Does that sound familiar? That's Joshua 1:8. Beware of people who will use the Bible to promote their own selfish ends. There are people who will do it. They will sprinkle in a few Bible verses to make it seem like it's okay. And he uses this language to justify his twisted, wicked actions. And so verse 29, they show up at the house. David commands the men, and we see there that Amnon dies. The remaining verses are a bit confusing, but in the fog of war, a report comes to David that everybody is dead, which of course is not true. And there's one person, this man again, verse 32, Jonadab, he clears it up and says, no, David, they're not all dead. Only Amnon is dead. Now, I can't prove this, but the text seems to imply, how would Jonadab have known that if he wasn't in on it? It seems to imply that just as he plotted with Amnon, he also helped to plot with Absalom. Or he at least knew it and didn't do anything about it. He says, no, they're not all dead. I know that only Amnon is dead. And so they wait around until the king's sons return, and David there, it says, he weeps bitterly, realizing that only Amnon is dead, and Absalom, it says, he flees. He goes off to a foreign country, makes his way actually to his grandfather's house, and there he hides out. And this is setting up for us what's going to be the tension between David and Absalom. It's easy to read this story and to feel sympathetic to Absalom. I think we all feel that way. To say, wait a minute, David didn't do his job. Somebody should have done something. And yes, that is true, but revenge is not justice. There's a thin line between justifiable anger and sinful vengeance, and Absalom crossed that line. Absalom went too far. My friends, this is a reminder to us that the sins of others do not justify our own sins. Don't we learn it as little kids? Right? Why did you do that? Well, because he did this. He stole my popsicle. He called me a name. And then we feel like we're now in a position to take it into our own hands. But my friends, God's people are never to respond to evil with more evil. Scripture is clear in Romans 12. Never take your own revenge. So my question this morning, is there anybody here feeling the feelings of Absalom? Something happened years ago and you are still seething about it. You're still bitter about it. You're still holding a grudge, and it's just getting deeper and deeper and deeper. My friends, never take your own revenge, but Paul says, leave room for the wrath of God, for vengeance is mine, I will repay. Which brings me back to where I started. As Christians, we read this story and we cringe and we weep and we get angry, but we also hope. What is the hope? That God has said, I will repay. We get to the end of this chapter and we see the whole royal family of David is in shambles. We see Amnon, the son of David, doing this very disgraceful, unrighteous thing. We see Absalom, the son of David, who perpetrates his own vengeance and injustice. And we get to the end of the chapter and we're left wondering, is there not a son of David who can do what's right? Is there not a son of David who knows righteousness? Is there not a son of David who can sit on the throne and be blameless? And the answer of the New Testament is yes, his name is Jesus. He is the son of David. And one day all the Amnons of the world will stand before him. All the Absaloms of the world will stand before him. All the Jonadabs of the world will stand before him. The sexual offenders and murderers and crooked leaders, and he himself will take care of it. When the true Son of David sits on the throne, we will live in a world, a new heavens and a new earth. And in that place, my friends, listen, there will be no more pain. Women will not fear men. Men will not shed blood. There won't be bitterness and grudges and all the sin, sickness that we see in this text. Why? For the first things have passed away. And He will make it all new. And so that's why I say to you this morning, if you are not a Christian, not only do we in the gospel offer you salvation and forgiveness and freedom of guilt and shame, we offer you a future. A glorious future when the God of the universe will make all things right. And He will settle the accounts that need to be settled. And He will bring righteousness and justice to every single place on the face of the earth. Scripture says, the Old Testament, these things are written for our instruction, that we might not crave evil things as they did. The sins of Amnon and David and Absalom are not far from us. And may God keep us from them.